The reading from Ephesians today covers a lesson made popular in Sunday school, I think among other reasons because of the kind of textual way of learning the so-called armor of God. I remember we would draw life-size cutouts of ourselves and then paint in the armor. Or we would make paper cutouts of the armor itself and wear it like a costume. The helmet of salvation, the breastplate of righteousness, the belt of truth, the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, and the shield of faith. The lesson was for us to put on our armor and to be ready to fight. As a boy, I remember thinking, that's a lot to put on just to get out the door. And I couldn't make sense of why we were being taught to fight like warriors. I remember, particularly in middle school, my parents went to the theater to watch the film Braveheart. But we couldn't join them because we were not old enough. Now, why was it that we were expected to fight like warriors wearing this armor, but we couldn't actually see the film about people dressed in armor fighting an actual war? Irony aside, the letter offers us timeless lesson on the spiritual warfare which is at the core of all of our conflict. And here's how I think Paul's letter aids us in our understanding. Paul tells us, one, of who we are fighting, two, how we are to fight, and three, what we can do to support one another. In any battle, you'll agree with me that it is critical to understand our opponent. In circumstances that we do not know our opponent, we consider that fighting blind. Paul says here that our struggle is not against enemies made of flesh and blood. Our fight is not with other humans. Now, isn't that interesting? Most of our fight seems to be directed at someone or some person. At least that's the way our world talks about it. We direct blame to a person. We create lists of people we like to block out, or we create a mental list of people to avoid. This is how many of us operate, and yet Paul says that we've got it wrong. Our enemy is not made of flesh and blood. Rather, our fight is against spiritual forces of evil, against rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this present darkness. Now, it would do us good to consider each of these descriptions and think upon what they would mean. But even if we don't, I think that the core message becomes clear to us. It has become clear to me in my past, but that message is that our fight is not and should not be against one another. For a long period of my life growing up, I thought people were evil. In middle school, I thought that the boy who was bullying me was evil. I thought that bad people who did bad things, like criminals and thieves, that they were evil, but evidently I was not grounded well in Scripture, because this kind of thinking targets the individual as an enemy, but Scripture tells us to look deeper, to look beyond the person. It was a while back, there was a lot of conflict in the Indian Ocean near the Horn of Africa. Somali people would seize large trade vessels, and the news that were covering the story were calling them pirates, Somali Pirates. You'd think that they were evil for taking by force what was not theirs. Only back in Somalia, these people were considered local heroes. Like the legend of Robin Hood, they provided for the impoverished. So, were the Somali really pirates? Were they a hero? Were they evil or were they good? Paul's lesson helps us to shift perspective so that we don't simply have our own single-sided descriptor of what is happening, that Somali people were bad, but it compels us to consider their narrative, the perspective that they have, and it makes us to see the evil that was underlying the system that had been created. Now, you may already know this, but the trade routes that connected Asia to the Mediterranean areas and even up to Europe, you had to either go by land or by water, except if you were to pass by land, you'd have to pass by some of the most conflict-driven, some of the most unstable places. And then traveling by water or sending your vessel by water meant going all the way around the southern tip of Africa, which was a long way. These trading companies, they routed these container ships to pass by the Horn of Africa and up the Red Sea so that they could port somewhere off Egypt or Israel, which then they would send their merchandise by land a short distance up to the Mediterranean. It meant that trade vessels would have to pass through Somali waters, but these shipping containers, these shipping companies, did not give the Somali people their fair due. Imagine the billions of dollars worth of goods that is being traded by this route. But because the Somali government was too weak, they simply ignored them. And whatever the government was able to acquire, it remained largely with the authorities in place who lived lavishly while their people, their citizens, went hungry. Now, I may be incorrect, and I am willing to be corrected if I have not understood it correctly, but that is how I understood the conflict at the time. And yet, the developed countries, many of whom who profited from this practice, then went on to report that the Somali were pirating, that they were the problem, making us to think that they were evil. Paul would tell us to look deeper. Paul tells us that our struggle is against evil, systemic evil, not people, not each other. This is who we are fighting. And I hope that we have that mind frame for the fights that we have in our own lives. Now, Paul mentions also how we are to fight. It's noteworthy, though the image that we have is that it's a one-time occasion or an instance. Our fight is a momentary thing, but that's not what Paul describes here. The word that Paul uses for struggle is pale in Greek, which means to wrestle. You remember they had the Olympics, right? Greco-Roman wrestling. That is the exact analogy that Paul is comparing our struggle as. We're not talking about coming up with an attack strategy and a strong defense at home. It's not some cowboy movie scene with boots and a gun at the OK Corral. This is full body contact that Apostle Paul is telling us. There are no breaks. There are no offensive and defensive lines or measures. It is constant. It is an all the time kind of fighting. It's the kind of fighting that consumes your whole being, because the moment that you let your guard down, it'll be your end. It's exhausting. The challenge for us, of course, is that when we are exhausted, we tend to want to quit fighting. Or because we are exhausted, we don't want to fight another. Yet we need to learn how to pace ourselves, because we are, in Paul's other writings, in a marathon. Yes, even in running a marathon, you'll come across sections where we are to speed up and other sections where we will slow down. But the overarching goal would be that we finish the race, and likewise in our spiritual journey. Here is perhaps where I see Paul's lesson aiding us. Now, I don't know if you caught this, but when I was describing the armor that we put on, I left out one piece. The shoes. I left out the shoes. Paul says to put on shoes that make us ready to proclaim the peace, the gospel of peace. And that is really helpful for me because it reminds me that, well, one, we're not alone in our struggle, and that our strength comes from our collective, this collective of faith, not just our own internal will. Our battle against the forces of evil was not one to be fought alone. I mean, yes, each of us will need to fight. We cannot be idle in this battle. We must do our part, no matter how significant or insignificant that may seem. And yet, we do not fight it alone. We fight in this squad, in this as a community of faith. And when we can't battle for one another, or we cannot fight for the other directly, we can at least offer peace to one another and encourage one another. That peace goes a long way. I once ran a half marathon. I was crazy because I had not prepared for it. Somehow I thought that I would be able to run it without any preparation. I thought it'd be quite simple. It was not. I wanted to quit after the second mile. I had just begun and I was, oh no, I want to go back. But just as I was really contemplating whether or not I should continue running, I heard an encouragement by a complete stranger directed right at me. They must have seen my conflict written on my face. They would tell me, "You got it. Let's go." And so, not to embarrass myself in front of this person, I ran a little bit more, and sure enough, another person encouraging. I'd run some more, and by some time there was a group that I had joined, and we were all pacing each other. I had no idea who this group was, and yet a bunch of strangers pacing each other out. Somewhere near mile 10 of this race, my legs gave out. They started to have these spasms. I've never experienced this before. I couldn't stand. I couldn't walk. Some of the aides came with this cooling liquid spray, and they sprayed down my legs. And somehow I got my muscles to work again. And so I tried to continue. I tried to finish. But really, the last half mile or so, I was really struggling. You've probably seen images of marathon runners by the finish line who were kind of wonky, their legs giving out under them. Well, this was a half marathon, and this was me, and I couldn't walk. I couldn't stand. My legs would not do what I was telling them to do. And I came in half a mile to the finish line on the shoulders of two complete strangers who kept telling me, "I got this." I clearly did not. They had me, and yet they were encouraging me. I got this. I was only able to finish that race because of the peace givers, because of the encouragers that I met that way. Some of us fight well while others cannot. Or rather, there are some battles that are easier for some and more difficult for others. I'm really grateful for the way that we continue to learn through this experience, through the pandemic. In particular, I've learned, how difficult it is to be masked at all times. I thought of how much harder it is to be masked for those who were really needing to be active in their line of work. I thought about how difficult it is for people who are claustrophobic. I thought about how difficult it is for people who don't have the dexterity as others to put on the mask. My young daughter, when she first began, was just 3 years old. Trying to put on a mask was not something her little fingers could do. I'm constantly reminded that as much as I would like for the entire world to be masked right now, it is so utterly difficult because all of our abilities differ that much. Some are going to find it more difficult than others. And it's important for us to have that kind of perspective. We all face battles. For some of us, that battle is food security, for housing, for education, for employment, for time with family, and for some time away from family. There are many, but clearly all of us are in a fight. And just as clearly, nobody wants to be. Nobody wants to be in this struggle. Despite the fact that both our Hebrew text and the New Testament Gospels both talk about some form of toil and trouble in our lives, I doubt anyone actually looks forward to it. Most of us just don't have a choice. So it seems to me that if we are all in this fight, in this struggle against the evil, against the powers of evil, then it should change the way we relate with others. At least that's how I imagine it. It should change the way we perceive and work with others. I mean, in some ways, we are already doing so. We wouldn't drink casually in front of someone that we know is a recovering alcoholic. We don't offer coffee or other beverages to someone who is of the Latter-day Saints tradition. We watch our language in presence of young children. For those others who are culturally inclined, we would not swat at a mosquito or a fly in the presence of a Buddhist. The list goes on. We know how to change how we relate to one another based on certain circumstances. The difference that Paul has for us, Paul is telling us that it's not sometimes, but that it is always. It's not when it's convenient for us, but that we must always look to support one another because we are all facing the same evil, the same struggle, and that struggle is constant. You know, the university started, and if you are like some of those in my old congregation back in Tucson, it is also a time for the great avoidance. Every year, before COVID, when the semester began and the streets were congested, parking lots would be full, I would almost regularly hear comments about how or what a pain the young people were and how terrible they drive or how they walk with their eyes glued to their phones. Members would avoid coming to the campus whenever possible, opting to meet only on Sundays or, if absolutely necessary, on Saturdays when they knew classes were not in session. And they'd hold meetings if it was on a weekday during the day so that they didn't have to drive through the traffic. I wonder if you can relate. Now, I understood that for this church, that was a commuter church for most of the congregation. They had to drive to church, and driving, in truth, was becoming a bit more challenging with every passing year. Our reactions would slow down, our eyesight gets progressively worse. Driving at night becomes increasingly challenging. And in general, confidence in operating this 2-ton vehicle, well, that goes down, let alone how the number of students seem to grow every year. I understood their concerns and I grieved at how it appears to the young person. For a church that valued young adults, at least on paper and in their testament, they sure ended up looking like they avoided them all the time. Now, this past Thursday afternoon, I also came by our campus, and I witnessed something incredible. The streets were flooded with ASU students. My heart was full of joy to see so many young people, and yet it was also grieved. I thought about how difficult it must be for them. We have over 15,000 incoming freshmen. It's the largest incoming class ever. Most of these students probably spent the last year of high school schooling from home without things like the prom or a traditional graduation. These are the very things that help form who they were, and they had to live without that. And here they were entering into a new season of life, trying to adult for the first time with any real consequence during a time that is still very much uncertain. It appeared to me they were all in the fight. They were fighting it. And there were evils surrounding all of them. Evil that told them that they were a somebody or a nobody based on what they wear or how they appeared or what ability they have or what grades they got. The evil that toxifies their masculinity or their femininity. The evil that they're trying to escape from through education, or the evil that they will eventually become bound to in order to survive. And I kept thinking, well, who will be there for them? Who will tell them that they are not alone in this constant struggle? Who will offer them peace? Who will offer them the warmth and comfort of our loving God? I wonder if Paul's lesson for us today is less about putting on armor for us to fight, but really about seeing each other as partners in this fight together, about offering peace and encouragement to our fellow citizens of the earth and our common and constant struggle to fight evil here and everywhere. And I hope that that may be the way that we live strong and the way that we can put God's love for the world into action. May it be so.